What would you do if someone offered you a way out of your desperation, but the price was carrying his child? Julia Evans never imagined that a rainy afternoon would lead her to the glass tower of Owen Blake, a billionaire who didn't want love, just an heir. One look, one proposal, one night that would change everything. Because sometimes what starts as a cold arrangement ends up burning hotter than anyone could have predicted. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the super thanks button as well. Comment and let us know where you're listening from. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. The rain fell like blades over Newark, New Jersey, turning the streets into grey mirrors that reflected the heavy sky of an autumn afternoon. Julia Evans stood by the fogged window of her small third-floor apartment, watching the drops slide down the glass like tears she no longer had the strength to cry. The smell of reheated coffee hung in the air, mixed with the sweet scent of the cheap shampoo she'd used that morning. Her hands trembled as she held her cell phone, not from cold, but from a silent fear that had been with her for months. 8 months. 8 long months without work. 8 months watching her bank account dwindle like a candle in the wind. 8 months caring alone for Margaret, her mother, whose memory was fading day by day, victim to an early onset Alzheimer's that stole not only memories, but Julia's hope as well. She was 27 years old. She should have been building her career as an architect, designing buildings that touched the sky, creating spaces where people could live their dreams. But life had other plans. The economic crisis destroyed the firm where she worked. Medical bills piled up like bricks on her shoulders. And now here she was, trapped between the peeling walls of an apartment she could barely afford, feeling the weight of the world crushing her soul. The phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. Julia hesitated. Debt collectors called every day. But something, maybe desperation, maybe intuition, made her answer. Hello? The voice on the other end was female, professional, almost sharp. Julia Evans, this is Sarah Mitchell from Blake Construction Group. Mr. Blake would like to meet with you tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. Can you make it? Julia blinked, confused. Blake Construction, that billion-dollar company that built skyscrapers all over the country. Why on earth would they call her? Yes, of course. May I ask what this is about? Mr. Blake prefers to discuss it in person. I'll send you the address by text. See you tomorrow, Miss Evans. The call ended before Julia could ask any more questions. She stood there, her heart beating erratically in her chest. This didn't make sense. No sense at all. But when you're drowning in desperation, even a broken plank looks like a life raft. The next morning, Julia woke before sunrise. She chose her best outfit, slightly faded black dress pants and a white button-up blouse that still maintained some dignity. She pulled her brown hair into a low bun, applied a light touch of mascara and nude lipstick. She didn't have much more than that. But she needed to look confident. She needed to look like she was still somebody. Before leaving, she went into her mother's room. Margaret was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall with empty eyes. Julia knelt beside her, holding her cold, wrinkled hand. "Mom, I need to go out for a few hours. Mrs. Rodriguez is going to stay with you, okay?" Margaret slowly turned her face, but there was no recognition in her eyes, just an emptiness that broke Julia's heart into pieces. "You're a pretty girl," Margaret murmured, as if speaking to a stranger. Julia swallowed the lump in her throat, kissed her mother's forehead, and left quickly before the tears could fall. The Blake Construction Group headquarters was in the heart of Manhattan, a tower of glass and steel that cut through the clouds like a gleaming sword. Julia climbed the marble steps on shaky legs, feeling tiny before this cathedral of power and money. The sound of her shoes echoed in the lobby, mixed with the murmur of well-dressed executives who rushed past, carrying leather briefcases and ambition in their eyes. She identified herself at the reception desk. An impeccable assistant led her to the top floor, where the silence was almost reverent. The hallway smelled of fine wood and Italian coffee. The walls displayed awards, certificates, and photos of monumental constructions scattered around the world. The main office door opened, and then Julia saw him. Owen Blake. He was standing by the panoramic window, his back to her, hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored dress pants. He had broad shoulders, upright posture, slightly disheveled black hair, as if he'd run his hand through it repeatedly. When he turned around, Julia felt the air leave her lungs. 34 years old, dark grey eyes that seemed to see through to the soul, a defined jawline, firm lips, a severe and dangerous beauty. But what struck her most wasn't his appearance, it was the intensity. He observed her as if she were a complex puzzle he needed to solve. Miss Evans. His voice was deep, controlled, but carried an invisible electrical current. "Thank you for coming." Julia swallowed hard. "Mr. Blake." He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She obeyed, feeling her knees weaken. Owen sat as well, laced his fingers on the desk, and studied her in silence for long seconds. The wall clock marked each beat like a drum in Julia's chest. "You're more than I expected," he finally said. Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "I researched you. Graduated with honors from Pratt Institute. Award-winning projects in urban sustainability. A brilliant mind wasted because the world collapsed at the wrong time." She felt her face flush. "Why are you telling me this?" Owen leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Because I need someone like you. Someone strong. Someone who doesn't give up even when everything seems lost." "For an architecture project," he paused, and then, with disturbing calm, he answered, "No, to give me a child." Julia's world stopped. The sound of the city below disappeared. The ticking of the clock vanished. All that remained was that grey gaze piercing her soul and those impossible words echoing in her mind. What? She could barely whisper. Owen didn't look away. "I need an heir. I don't want marriage. I don't want emotional complications. I want a clear, fair agreement that benefits us both." Julia stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You're insane." "I'm being practical." He also stood, walking around the desk with slow, deliberate steps. "You're drowning in debt. Your mother needs specialized treatment you can't afford. You've been unemployed for months. I can change all of that. All of it." He stopped just inches from her. Julia felt the heat radiating from his body, the subtle scent of wood and mint, the restrained strength in every muscle. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Give me an heir," he said quietly, his eyes briefly dropping to her lips before returning to her gaze. "And I'll give you a new life." Julia stepped back, but her back met the glass wall. She was trapped between the abyss outside and Owen Blake's overwhelming presence in front of her. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. Her fingers searched for something to hold on to, finding only the cold, smooth surface of the glass. "You can't be serious," she murmured, but her voice came out weak, unconvincing. Owen took a step back, as if realizing the proximity was suffocating her. He returned behind his desk, picked up a brown leather folder, and held it out to her. "I'm completely serious. Read it." Julia took the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a detailed contract, written in impeccable legal language. She flipped through the pages, her eyes racing over the absurd clauses that seemed straight out of a movie. In vitro fertilization, no intimate physical contact necessary, shared custody after birth, 3-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, fully furnished and paid for, complete medical treatment coverage for Margaret Evans, including specialized palliative care, monthly salary of $20,000 during pregnancy, position as Director of Sustainable Projects at Blake Construction Group after birth, with starting salary of $150,000 annually. Julia raised her eyes, stunned. This was enough money to completely change her life, to save her mother, to breathe again. "Why me?" The question came out as a hoarse whisper. Owen leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed over his chest. The afternoon light came through the window, creating a golden halo around him, but his eyes remained dark, inscrutable. "I already told you, you're strong. There are thousands of strong women out there. Why me specifically?" He was silent for a long moment, as if carefully choosing his words. Then, with a brutal honesty that disarmed her, he answered, "Because when I look at you, I don't just see someone desperate. I see someone who loves so much they'd be capable of anything. And that kind of love, that kind of strength. That's what I want my child to carry. Julia felt something break inside her chest. No one had ever spoken about her that way, as if she were more than just an overwhelmed daughter, more than a failed architect, more than a woman on the verge of collapse. "You don't know me," she said, her voice faltering. "I know enough." She looked back at the contract, the letters blurred by the tears pooling in her eyes. It was insane. Absolutely insane. But it was also the only lifeline in the ocean where she was drowning. "What if I say no?" Owen tilted his head, his lips curving into a sad half-smile. "Then you walk out that door, go back to your life, and I find someone else. But we both know you won't say no." The arrogance of those words should have infuriated her, but he was right, and they both knew it. "I need time to think. You have until 5 tomorrow afternoon." Julia nodded, took the folder, and walked to the door on shaky legs. When she put her hand on the doorknob, his voice stopped her. "Julia." She turned. Owen was standing again, hands in his pockets, his expression softened by something she couldn't identify. "I'm not trying to buy you. I'm offering you a choice, and maybe a chance to start over." She left without answering, but his words echoed in her mind during the entire subway ride back to Newark. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She sat in the tiny kitchen, the folder open on the cracked formica table, a cup of cold tea between her hands. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the peeling walls. She thought about her mother, about Margaret's empty eyes, about the medical bills piling up like an avalanche ready to bury her. She thought about the dreams she'd abandoned, the buildings she'd never design, the places she'd never visit, the life she'd never live. And she thought about Owen Blake, about those grey eyes that seemed to hold storms, about the deep voice that made her skin tingle, about the way he'd looked at her, not with pity but with something dangerously close to respect. "You're more than I expected." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath. The apartment smelled of mold and disinfectant. Outside, sirens cut through the night. A child cried upstairs. This was her reality. This was the hole she couldn't climb out of, unless she accepted a stranger's outstretched hand. The next day at 4:45 in the afternoon, Julia stood once again before the glass tower. This time she didn't hesitate. She went up with firm steps, the signed contract inside her worn purse. Owen received her personally. When she placed the contract on his desk, he showed no surprise. He simply nodded, as if he'd already known she would return. "Are you sure?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice that caught her off guard. "No," Julia admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." He extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement." Julia looked at that hand, large, strong, with long, elegant fingers. She hesitated only a second before taking it. The touch was electric. His skin was warm, rough, and the firm grip sent a wave of heat through her entire body. They stayed like that for a moment too long to be merely professional. His eyes searched hers, and Julia saw something there that wasn't in the contract, something dangerous, forbidden, inevitable. "We'll start next week," Owen said, but didn't release her hand. "The doctors will evaluate you. You'll move into the new apartment. Everything will be arranged." "And you?" Julia asked, her voice coming out huskier than intended. "Where do you fit into this equation?" Owen finally released her hand, but his fingers slid along hers in an accidental or intentional caress. Impossible to know. "I stay where I've always been. On the outside, watching." But as he said this, he moved closer again. So close that Julia could smell his cologne, woody, masculine, intoxicating. So close that she had to lift her chin to face him. "But something tells me," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, "that watching won't be enough." Julia felt her entire body tremble, not from fear, from something much more frightening. "That wasn't in the agreement," she whispered. His lips curved into a slow, seductive, devastating smile. "No, it wasn't." And in that moment, as the tension between them grew like a storm about to explode, Julia realized she'd entered a game far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Because Owen Blake didn't just want an heir. He wanted her, and God help her, she wanted him too. The move happened in less than a week. Julia still couldn't believe that this spacious, bright apartment in the Upper West Side was really hers, or at least would be for the next few months. 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a modern kitchen with appliances she didn't even know existed, bathrooms with marble finishes. It was like stepping into a dream after years wandering through a nightmare. Margaret had her own room, decorated in soft shades of blue and beige, with an adjustable hospital bed and all the necessary equipment. A specialized nurse, Mrs. Chen, took care of her during the day. At night, Julia sat beside her mother, held her hand, and read passages from old books, even knowing Margaret no longer understood the words. But it was on Tuesday and Thursday nights that everything changed. Those were the nights Owen came to dinner. He'd insisted on it. "We need to get to know each other better," he'd said in that deep voice that made something strange happen in Julia's stomach. "This isn't just a business arrangement. We're going to raise a child together. She deserves for her parents to at least understand each other." Parents. The word sounded strange, frightening, too real. On the first Tuesday, Owen arrived promptly at 7 in the evening. He wore dark jeans and a grey shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong tanned forearms. No tie, no impeccable suit. More human, more dangerous. He brought bags from an Italian restaurant. "Don't know how to cook?" Julia asked, trying to keep her tone light while her pulse raced. "I can make burnt omelettes and passable coffee," he replied with a half smile. Thought it was better not to risk it. They ate at the kitchen table, surrounded by the smell of fresh basil, garlic, and olive oil. At first the conversation was hesitant, formal, punctuated by uncomfortable silences. But then Owen asked about her childhood, and something broke open. Julia talked about growing up in Newark, daughter of a literature teacher and a mechanic who died when she was 12, about how her mother had worked 3 jobs to pay for her college, about nights drawing by candlelight because the electricity had been cut off, about dreaming of buildings that touched the stars. "And you?" she asked, encouraged by the red wine he'd brought, though she'd barely drunk any. "What's it like growing up as Owen Blake?" He was silent for a long moment, his fingers spinning the wine glass. The soft kitchen light accentuated the angles of his face, the shadows under his eyes. "Lonely," he finally admitted. "My father abandoned me before I was born. My mother built an empire but never had time for a son. I was raised by nannies, drivers, private tutors. All I had was money. And money doesn't hug you back when you wake up in the middle of the night afraid of the dark." Julia felt her heart tighten. There was a vulnerability in those words that contrasted completely with the powerful man she'd met in the office. "Is that why you want a child?" she asked gently. "So you won't be alone anymore?" Owen raised his eyes. His grey gaze pierced through her. "That's why I want to be a better father than mine ever was." They stayed like that, looking at each other across the table, while something invisible but palpable stretched between them like a silk thread. Then Owen stood, began clearing the plates. Julia helped him, side by side at the sink, washing dishes together in comfortable silence, their arms sometimes brushing accidentally. Each touch sent small electric shocks through Julia's skin. When he left late that night, Owen stopped at the door. He turned to her, studied her face with an intensity that left her breathless. "You're beautiful when you're vulnerable," he said quietly. Julia swallowed hard. "I don't usually let anyone see that." He took a step closer, so close that she felt the heat radiating from him like waves. "But I'm not just anyone." And he left, leaving Julia alone with her racing heart, and the certainty that she was falling into an abyss with no safety net. The following Thursday he came back, this time with Thai food and a bottle of white wine. They ate in the living room, sitting on the couch, with the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars. The conversation flowed more easily this time. Owen talked about the first building he'd designed alone at 22, about the fear of failing, of proving that everyone who doubted him was right, about the night he stood alone at the top of that building, watching the city wake up, and realized he'd finally built something that would last longer than him. "And you?" he asked, turning to her on the couch. They were closer now, their knees almost touching. "What was the moment you knew you wanted to be an architect?" Julia smiled, her eyes distant with the memory. "I was 8 years old. My mother took me to see the New York Public Library. Those marble lions, the enormous columns, the painted ceiling. I stood there so small looking up, and I thought, someone imagined this. Someone took a dream and turned it into stone and beauty, and I decided I wanted to do that too. I wanted to leave something beautiful in the world. When she turned her gaze back to Owen, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. There was tenderness there, and desire, and something deeper that frightened her. "You still can," he said softly. "Make beautiful things, leave your mark. After I give you what you want." He frowned. "That's not how I see it. You're not giving me anything. We're creating something together." Before Julia could respond, Owen raised his hand and, with disconcerting gentleness, brushed away a strand of hair that had escaped from her ponytail. His fingers grazed Julia's cheek, then slid along her jawline, pausing just below her ear. The world stopped. Julia couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel. The heat of those fingers, the weight of that gaze, the electricity running through every nerve ending in her body. "Julia," he murmured her name like a prayer. She closed her eyes. If she didn't look at him, maybe she could maintain control. Maybe she could remember that this was just an arrangement, just business. But then she felt his breath closer, felt his thumb caressing her cheek. And when she opened her eyes, he was there, inches away, his eyes fixed on her lips. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. Julia should have said it, should have pulled away, should have remembered the contract clauses, the lines that shouldn't be crossed. But instead she whispered back, "No." And that was all Owen needed to hear. He closed the distance slowly, giving her time to pull back. But Julia didn't pull back. She leaned forward, meeting him halfway. The kiss was soft, almost chaste, lips touching with a hesitation that contrasted with the tension that had been building between them for weeks. But then Owen deepened the kiss, and Julia was lost. Her hands found his shoulders, fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair. The kiss became more urgent, more desperate, as if they were both dying of thirst and had finally found water. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Owen rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing ragged. "This wasn't in the agreement," he murmured. Julia gave a low, trembling laugh. Then maybe the agreement never made sense. He pulled away abruptly, ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was already beginning to recognize. We can't." "Why not?" "Because this complicates everything." He stood up, began pacing the room. "Because this wasn't what I planned. Because you deserve more than a man who doesn't know how to love." Julia also stood, her eyes burning. "And who said I want love? Maybe I just want this. Whatever this is." Owen stopped, turned to her. His gaze was stormy, conflicted. "You're lying. To me and to yourself." And before she could respond, he left. Julia stood alone in the living room, her lips still tingling, her heart both shattered and racing at the same time. Because Owen Blake was right. She was lying. And the truth was far more frightening than any agreement could predict. The following days were tense, charged with a silence that screamed louder than any words. Owen didn't come back for dinners. He sent brief, professional messages, asking about the medical exams, the consultations with fertility specialists, the preparations for the procedure. Julia responded in the same tone, short, objective, pretending that kiss had never happened. But at night, alone in the enormous bed of the silent apartment, she'd run her fingers over her lips and remember his taste, the heat, the way he held her as if she were simultaneously fragile and indestructible. The medical consultations were invasive and uncomfortable. Blood tests, ultrasounds, intimate questions about her menstrual cycle, her reproductive health, her family history. Everything recorded, analyzed, quantified. Julia felt more like an object than a person, an incubator being prepared for its function. And then came time for the hormone injections. Dr. Martinez, a kind woman with brown eyes and graying hair, explained the process with clinical patience. "You'll need to take daily hormone injections to stimulate ovulation. They're subcutaneous, applied to the abdomen. I can teach you to do it yourself, or someone can help." The process lasts about 10 to 12 days. Julia nodded, trying to absorb all the information that seemed to float in her head like smoke. I can do it myself. But that night, when she held the first syringe, her hands shook so much she nearly dropped it. She looked at the thin needle, at the clear liquid inside, at the exposed skin of her abdomen. Fear paralyzed her. She tried, brought the needle close to her skin, but she couldn't stick that piece of metal into her own body. She sat on the edge of the bed, tears falling silently. She felt pathetic, weak, incapable. The phone rang. Owen. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Did you take the injection?" His voice was neutral, but Julia caught something underneath, concern. "I tried." Silence on the other end. "I'm coming over." "Owen, you don't need to..." But he'd already hung up. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Julia opened the door, still red-eyed, wearing only a thin cotton nightshirt and shorts. Owen stood there in jeans and a black leather jacket, his hair mussed by the night wind. His eyes swept over her quickly, assessing, and something in that look made her blush. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside, letting him pass. The apartment was silent. Mrs. Chen had already left. Margaret slept soundly in her room. Owen got straight to the point. "Where are the syringes?" Julia pointed to the box on the living room table. He picked one up, examined it, then looked at her. "Can you lie down on the couch?" Julia obeyed, lying on her back, her heart beating irregularly. Owen knelt beside her, too close, too intimate. He opened the sterile package with precise movements, prepared the injection. "You need to lift your shirt," he said softly. Julia swallowed hard. With trembling fingers, she raised the hem of her nightshirt, exposing her abdomen. Her skin prickled with the cold air, or perhaps with his gaze. Owen cleaned the area with alcohol. The touch was professional, but Julia felt every millimeter of those fingers against her skin. He gently pinched the flesh, forming a small fold. "It'll hurt a little," he warned. "Take a deep breath." Julia inhaled. She felt the quick prick, a brief burning, and then it was over. Done. He applied a small bandage, but his hand lingered there, resting on her abdomen, his thumb tracing unconscious circles on her skin. Julia couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly, could only feel that heat, that delicious pressure of his hand on her. "Owen," she whispered. He raised his eyes, and Julia saw the conflict in them, saw desire fighting against reason. Slowly, he withdrew his hand, but not before letting his fingers slide across her skin in a caress that sent shivers through her entire body. "I'll come every night," he said, his voice hoarse, "to give you the injections. You don't need to." "I know, but I'm coming anyway." And he came. Every night at 9 o'clock sharp, Owen rang the doorbell. He'd enter with that magnetic presence that filled the entire space. And Julia would lie on the couch, expose her belly, and let him touch her. Each night became more intimate than the last. On the third night, his fingers lingered longer on her abdomen, tracing the line from her hip to her waist with a reverence that made her tremble. On the fifth night, Julia wore only a short crop top, exposing more skin than necessary. She saw his eyes darken, his jaw tighten. On the seventh night, she cried. The hormones were wreaking havoc on her emotions. Everything felt amplified, the sadness, the loneliness, the fear, the desire. The tears started falling even before the injection. Hey. Owen set down the syringe, his hands finding her face, wiping away the tears with his thumbs. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Julia sobbed. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." "You are." He held her face firmly, forcing her to look at him. "You're stronger than you think. Stronger than I'll ever be." "I'm not." She shook her head. "I'm terrified, Owen. Terrified of doing this alone. Terrified of failing. Terrified of..." "Of what?" She closed her eyes. "Of feeling too much." Heavy silence. When Julia opened her eyes, she saw something break in his face, saw the exact moment when the walls he'd built began to crumble. "Julia!" He whispered her name like a confession, and then pulled her to his chest. Julia clung to him, her face buried in his shirt, inhaling that scent that had already become familiar. Woody, masculine, comforting. his arms wrapped around her tightly, one hand caressing her hair, the other pressed against her back. "You're not alone," he murmured against the top of her head. "I'm here." And for the first time in months, maybe years, Julia allowed herself to believe that someone really was. They stayed like that for long minutes, hearts beating against each other, breaths synchronizing, the world outside ceasing to exist. When they finally separated, Owen still held her face between his hands. His eyes traced every feature, the red eyes, the wet cheeks, the parted lips. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "Even like this, especially like this." Julia felt something break and reassemble at the same time inside her chest. "Owen, what are we doing?" He closed his eyes, rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know, but I can't stop." And neither of them mentioned the contract. Neither remembered the rules, because the rules had already become irrelevant. What was growing between them was bigger than any signed paper. It was inevitable, it was frightening, and it was only beginning. On the 10th night, the last injection, Owen arrived earlier. He brought a small box wrapped in gold paper. "What's this?" Julia asked, surprised. "Open it." Inside was a delicate necklace, a house-shaped pendant made of silver, with small architectural details engraved on it. "To remember," he said softly, "that you're still an architect, and that you're going to build beautiful things again." Julia felt the tears return, but this time they were different, warmer, sweeter. "Thank you," she whispered. Owen put the necklace on her, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck, sending shivers down her spine. When he finished, he didn't step back. He stayed there, behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Tomorrow is the fertilization," he said quietly. "I know. And after, everything changes." Julia turned to face him. "It already changed, Owen. A long time ago." He studied her in silence, and then, with torturous slowness, leaned in and kissed her forehead. A chaste kiss, tender, loaded with unspoken promises. When he left that night, Julia touched the necklace around her neck and knew with absolute certainty that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. And the most frightening thing of all, she didn't want to go back. The day of the fertilization dawned grey and cold. November had arrived in New York, bringing cutting winds that made people shrink inside heavy coats. Julia woke before the alarm, her stomach churning with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Today was the day. Today, science would do what nature would do otherwise. Today, she would take the first real step toward a motherhood that still felt surreal. The fertility clinic was on a quiet street in the Upper East Side. The building was discreet, elegant, with cream-colored walls and minimalist decor that tried to convey tranquility. But Julia felt anything but tranquil. Her fingers trembled as she filled out forms. Her heart raced every time a door opened. Owen was there, of course, sitting in the waiting room with perfect posture, wearing a dark grey suit that made him look simultaneously powerful and distant. When Julia entered, he stood immediately. His eyes swept over her, assessing, worried. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, but they both knew it was a lie. The procedure itself was quick and painless, but emotionally devastating. Julia lying on a gurney, legs spread, doctors and nurses treating her body like a vessel. Owen waited outside, at the clinic's request. When they finished, they told her to rest for 30 minutes before leaving. Julia lay alone in the silent room, staring at the white ceiling, and suddenly it all hit her at once, the enormity of what she'd just done, the life that might be beginning inside her at that very moment, the irreversibility of it all. And then she started to cry, not silent tears, deep sobs that came from the depths of her soul. All the tension, all the fear, all the loneliness of the past months, everything surfaced like a broken dam. The door opened. Owen came in, disregarding the rules, disregarding protocols. He simply saw her crying and couldn't stay away. "Julia?" He was beside her in seconds, his hand finding hers, squeezing tightly. "What happened? Did something go wrong?" "No," she managed to say between sobs. I just realized this is real. That this is really happening. And I'm terrified." Owen pulled up a chair, sat beside the gurney, but didn't let go of her hand. With his other hand, He brushed the wet hair from her face. "I am too," he confessed, and there was a raw vulnerability in his voice that Julia had never heard before. "I'm terrified of being a terrible father, of screwing everything up, of repeating my parents' mistakes." Julia squeezed his hand back. "You won't." "How can you be so sure?" "Because you're here." She looked at him through her tears. "Because you care. Because you're already better than you think you are." Something changed in his face. A softness. A surrender. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, cleaning the tears with his lips. They were chaste, comforting kisses, but each one burned Julia's skin like embers. "Let's go home," he murmured. "You need to rest." Owen took her back to the apartment personally. He ignored meetings, calls, appointments. He stayed beside her in the back seat of the car, his hands still intertwined with hers, and Julia realized this was no longer just an arrangement. It was something infinitely more complicated. At the apartment, he helped her settle on the couch, brought water, adjusted pillows. Mrs. Chen was taking care of Margaret, so they were alone in the living room, bathed in the grey afternoon light. "You should go," Julia said, but her voice had no conviction. "I'm sure you have work." "I'm not going anywhere," Owen replied, sitting on the couch beside her. So close their knees touched. They stayed in silence for a while, just existing together. The sound of the city below was muffled by the thick windows. The clock on the wall marked the seconds with a soft tick-tock. "Owen?" Julia broke the silence. "Yes? Why are you really doing this? And don't give me the rehearsed answer about wanting an heir. I want the truth." He was quiet for so long that Julia thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and loaded with emotion. "Because I'm tired of being alone. Because I built an empire. But at the end of the day, I go back to an empty house and realize none of it matters. Because I saw you in that office, desperate but still fighting, still strong, still capable of loving so deeply that you were willing to sacrifice everything for your mother. And I thought that if I could have someone like that in my life, someone who felt things so intensely, maybe I could learn to feel too." Julia felt her heart squeeze painfully. "Owen?" He turned to her, and for the first time she saw tears in his eyes. Not falling, just there, trapped, reflecting years of loneliness and pain. "I didn't want this," he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to feel anything, but you destroyed me, Julia, from the first moment. And now I can't pretend anymore that you're just the mother of my child. You're so much more." The air left Julia's lungs all at once. "What are you saying?" Owen held her face between his hands, his thumb caressing her cheek. "I'm saying this stopped being an arrangement a long time ago. I'm saying I can't stop thinking about you, that I wake up and you're the first thing on my mind, that when I'm away from you, I feel like a part of me is missing." Julia closed her eyes, tears streaming again. "Me too," she whispered. "I feel it too." "Then tell me to stop." He brought his face closer, his breath mixing with hers. "Tell me to leave. Tell me this is crazy." Julia opened her eyes. "It is crazy. I know. We signed a contract. I know. This is going to complicate everything. I know. Then why are you still here?" Owen smiled, a sad, vulnerable, completely devastating smile. "Because complicated is better than empty." And then Julia kissed him. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't hesitant, it was desperate, hungry, as if she were drowning and he was air. Her hands found his hair, pulling him closer. His mouth opened against hers, his tongue exploring, tasting, claiming. Owen pulled her into his lap, his hands firm on her waist, and Julia fit against him as if she'd been made for this. The kiss deepened, became more urgent. She felt his hands move up her back, fingers pressing against her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse. When they finally separated to breathe, both were panting. Owen's forehead pressed against hers, eyes closed, jaw tense. "We can't take this back," he murmured. "I don't want to go back." He opened his eyes, and what Julia saw there made her tremble. Pure desire, mixed with something deeper, more frightening. Something that looked dangerously like love. "I tried to fight this," he confessed, his voice hoarse. I swear I tried, but I can't anymore." "Then don't fight." Julia held his face, forcing him to look at her. "I'm here. I'm scared and confused, and I don't know what we're doing, but I'm here." Owen kissed her again, this time with more tenderness. A kiss that promised something beyond the physical. A kiss that whispered of possible futures, of choices not yet made, of a path that diverged completely from what they'd planned. When he finally pulled away, he remained holding her in his lap, arms firm around her, as if afraid she'd disappear if he let go. "Stay," Julia whispered. "Just for today. Stay with me." And Owen, the man who controlled empires and commanded boardrooms with a look, the man who never allowed anything to escape his control, surrendered. "Okay," he murmured against her hair. "I'll stay." And he stayed. They remained intertwined on the couch while afternoon turned to night. They talked about fears and dreams, about stolen childhoods and uncertain futures. Sometimes they kissed, sometimes they just held each other, and at some point, Julia fell asleep in his arms, feeling for the first time in years completely safe. When she woke, it was already deep night. Owen was still there, awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. "You didn't sleep," she murmured, drowsy. "I didn't want to miss a second of this," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. And in that moment, while the city pulsed below and the world kept turning, Julia knew with absolute certainty she had fallen in love with Owen Blake. And by the way he looked at her, with that mixture of wonder and terror, she suspected he had fallen in love with her too. What had begun as an arrangement had transformed into something no contract could contain. And there was no going back. The days following the fertilization were strange, suspended in a kind of emotional limbo. Julia was trapped in agonizing waiting. 2 weeks until the pregnancy test. 2 weeks to know if it had worked, if a new life was growing inside her. The doctors recommended moderate rest, no stress, healthy eating. But how could she not stress when her heart was at war with itself? After that night on the couch, after those kisses that changed everything, Owen had pulled back. Not physically. He still came to the apartment every day. But emotionally, he'd built walls again. He'd arrive in the late afternoon with healthy food, ask how she was feeling, check if she needed anything. But he kept his distance. He didn't touch her beyond what was necessary, didn't kiss her, barely looked her in the eyes. It was as if that vulnerability he'd shown had scared him so much he needed to hide behind his armor again. And it was killing Julia inside. She tried to understand. She knew Owen was used to controlling everything, to maintaining emotional distance, to not letting anyone in. She knew that what was happening between them was as frightening for him as it was for her, but that didn't make it easier, didn't make it less painful to watch him close himself off more and more. On Thursday night, a week after the fertilization, Owen arrived with sushi, the pregnancy-safe options, he made a point of mentioning. They ate in silence at the kitchen table. Julia tried to start conversations, but each one died quickly. Short answers, evasive looks, the weight of everything unsaid crushing the air between them. "How was work?" she asked, desperate to break the silence. "Busy. The Philadelphia project." "On schedule." "Owen." Julia put down her chopsticks, frustrated. "Are you going to keep doing this?" He raised his eyes, his expression carefully neutral. "Doing what?" "Pretending nothing happened. Pretending you didn't kiss me. That you didn't say those things to me." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I shouldn't have said them." The words hit Julia like a punch to the stomach. "What do you mean?" Owen sighed, ran his hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she knew so well. "It complicates things, Julia. I was vulnerable, you were vulnerable, and we let things go too far." "Too far?" Her voice trembled. "Are you serious right now? We need to keep focused on what matters. On the baby, on the agreement." "To hell with the agreement!" Julia stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "That damn piece of paper doesn't mean anything anymore. Not after what happened between us." Owen also stood, but kept his distance. His eyes were stormy, conflicted, but his voice came out too controlled, too cold. "It does mean something, because it's what keeps all this working. It's what keeps this from turning into a mess." "Too late," Julia said, tears beginning to fall. "It's already a mess, Owen. And you running won't change that. For a moment she saw something break in his expression, saw the pain, the desire, the fear, but then he composed himself, and the mask returned. I'm not running. I'm being realistic. You're a coward. The word hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Owen closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was a coldness there that made Julia's heart break. Maybe I am. But at least I'm not pretending this can have a happy ending. And he left, leaving Julia alone in the kitchen, the smell of sushi in the air and the bitter taste of rejection in her mouth. The following days were worse. Owen didn't come. He sent messages asking how she was, but never showed up. He had food delivered. He paid all the bills. He fulfilled his part of the agreement from a distance, as if Julia were just another project that needed to be managed. And Julia missed him in a way that frightened her, missed his grey eyes, missed his deep voice, missed the way he touched her during the injections, with that mixture of care and restrained desire, missed the conversations that flowed naturally, missed being seen, really seen, by someone. She tried to convince herself she was better off this way. That distance was safer, that focusing only on the baby was more sensible, but at night, when she lay alone in the enormous bed, she'd run her fingers over the house pendant around her neck and wonder if Owen missed her too. Margaret had a difficult week. The confusion episodes increased. One night she woke up screaming, convinced that men were invading the apartment. Julia had to hold her, calm her, sing the lullabies her mother used to sing to her as a child. It was exhausting, devastating, and she wanted Owen there, wanted to be able to lean on him, wanted to feel his arms around her, telling her everything would be okay. But he wasn't there. And Julia realized with painful clarity that maybe he never would be. On the night of the 13th day after fertilization, just one day before the test, Julia couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her hand resting on her abdomen, trying to feel if there was anything different. There wasn't. No sign. No change. Just silence. What would happen if she was pregnant? Would Owen remain distant? Would they raise a child in this coldness, in this soulless arrangement? Would the child grow up feeling the tension between them, the lack of love, the emotional distance? And what would happen if she wasn't pregnant? Would they try again? Would they go through this whole process again, pretending there was nothing but a contract between them? Tears rolled silently down Julia's face. She felt so alone, so lost. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. Message from Owen, 3:47 in the morning. Are you awake? Julia picked up the phone with trembling hands. Yes. 3 dots blinking. He was typing, stopping, typing again. Finally, the message came. I miss you. Julia's heart stopped. She looked at those 3 words on the bright screen, and something inside her broke and healed at the same time. Then why did you leave? The response took a while, but came. Because I'm afraid of what I feel for you. Because I've never felt this before and I don't know what to do with it. Because if I give myself completely and then lose you, I don't know if I'll survive. Julia cried harder, the phone shaking in her hands as she typed, You won't lose me. I'm here. I always have been. What if I mess everything up? What if I don't know how to love right? Nobody knows how to love right, Owen. We just try and fail and try again. Digital silence. No response. Julia waited, her heart pounding, the minutes dragging like hours. And then the doorbell rang. She jumped up, ran to the door, her heart in her throat. She opened it. Owen stood there in the dimly lit hallway, wearing sweats and jeans, his hair completely disheveled, his eyes red and tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked destroyed. He looked human. I can't stay away, he said, his voice cracking. I tried. I swear I tried, but I can't. Julia said nothing. She just took a step forward and threw herself into his arms. Owen held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling slightly. I'm sorry, he whispered against her head. I'm sorry for being a coward. I'm sorry for running. I'm sorry for... Stop, Julia interrupted, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. Stop apologizing and kiss me. And he obeyed. The kiss was different this time, not desperate, not urgent, but deep, slow, loaded with promise. As if it were a new beginning. As if it were a choice they were both making consciously despite all the fear. When they pulled apart, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow is the test," he murmured. "I know. And if it's positive, we'll deal with it together. And if it's negative, we'll deal with that together too." Owen opened his eyes, studied her face with an intensity that made her tremble. "You scare me, Julia Evans." "Why?" "Because you make me want things I swore I'd never want. Family, home, someone to come back to at night, someone who knows my fears and still chooses to stay." Julia smiled through her tears. "That's scary. Terrifying. Welcome to the club." He gave a low, hoarse laugh and kissed her again, a quick, tender kiss. "Can I stay?" he asked. "Just tonight. Just until the test tomorrow. I don't want you to go through this alone." "Yes," Julia whispered. "Please, stay." And Owen stayed. They lay together in the big bed, bodies intertwined, breaths synchronized. He traced distracted circles on her arm. She drew invisible patterns on his chest, and for the first time in weeks, they both managed to sleep. Because it didn't matter what the test said tomorrow, it didn't matter what came next. In that moment they had each other, and maybe that was enough. Morning came slowly, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Julia woke wrapped in the warmth of Owen's body, his arm heavy across her waist, his breath soft against the back of her neck. For a moment, before fully opening her eyes, she allowed herself to just exist in that peace. His scent on her skin, his comforting weight beside her, the feeling of no longer being alone. But then reality hit. Today was the day. 14 days after fertilization. The day of the blood test that would tell if she was pregnant or not. The day that would change everything one way or another. Julia felt her stomach churn with nervousness. Owen moved behind her, pulling her closer, mumbling something unintelligible in his sleep. She carefully turned in his arms, studying his relaxed face, the dark hair falling over his forehead, the slightly parted lips. He looked younger like this, more vulnerable, stripped of all the armor he wore during the day. As if feeling her gaze, Owen slowly opened his eyes. It took a few seconds to focus, and then a small hesitant smile curved his lips. "Hi," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Hi," Julia whispered back. They stayed like that for a moment, just looking at each other. And Julia saw 1,000 unspoken things in his grey eyes. Fear, hope, tenderness, desire. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," she admitted with brutal honesty. "I'm terrified." Owen raised his hand, brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Me too, but we'll be terrified together." The clinic was quiet that Friday morning. The same minimalist decor, the same antiseptic smell mixed with artificial lavender, the same feeling that here lives were created and destroyed with the same clinical frequency. The blood draw was quick, needle going in, tubes filling with dark red, a bandage. Done. Now they just had to wait. "The results will be ready in about 2 hours, the nurse said with a professional smile. "Doctor, Martinez will call as soon as we have the numbers. 2 hours, 120 minutes, 7,200 seconds of pure agony." Owen held Julia's hand as they left the clinic. The November air was cutting, the sky heavy with grey clouds threatening snow. The streets were full of hurried people, colourful scarves, steam rising from the subway vents like urban ghosts. "Coffee?" Owen suggested, but his voice didn't have its usual confidence. He was as nervous as she was. "I can't." "Caffeine," Julia gave a humorless laugh. "In case I'm, right." He ran his hand through his hair, the nervous gesture she'd learned to recognize. "We could walk, or go back to the apartment, or let's walk," Julia decided. "I need to move, or I'll go crazy." So they walked, without destination, just walking through the streets of Manhattan, side by side, sometimes with their hands intertwined, sometimes just close enough for their shoulders to touch. They passed shop windows decorated for Christmas, roasted chestnut vendors, street musicians playing melancholic melodies. "What if it doesn't work?" Julia asked suddenly, stopping in front of an old bookstore. What if the test is negative? Owen turned to her, held both her hands between his. Then we try again, if you want to. And you, do you want to? He hesitated, and Julia saw the conflict passing across his face, layers and layers of emotions he was still learning to process. I do, he finally said, but not just for the baby. I want this, you and me, whatever this is. I want the chance to find out. Julia's heart squeezed painfully. Owen, I know I'm not good at this, he continued, the words coming out fast, as if he needed to say everything before losing his courage. I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to really let someone in, but I want to learn. With you. For you. Julia felt the tears burn, but this time they were good tears, warm, hopeful. You're already learning, she said softly, placing her hand over his heart. Every day. Every time you show up. Every time you stay. Every time you choose not to run. Owen covered her hand with his, pressing it harder against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating fast. What if I mess everything up? Then we mess up together, and fix it together. That's how it works. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, his lips lingering there like a promise. You're so good, he murmured, too good for me. Stop saying that. You're not the terrible man you think you are. How can you be so sure? Because the terrible man wouldn't be here holding my hand and trembling with nervousness about a pregnancy test. The terrible man wouldn't have given me injections every night. The terrible man wouldn't have stayed with me when I cried. You're good, Owen Blake, even if you can't see it yet. He closed his eyes, and Julia saw a lone tear escape, sliding down his cheek before he could stop it. She wiped it away with her thumb, tenderly, and Owen held her wrist, turning his face to kiss her palm. Thank you, he whispered, for making me want to be better. Julia's phone rang. They both froze. She took the device from her pocket with trembling hands. On the screen, Dr. Martinez. Julia looked at Owen. He nodded, squeezing her hand. With her heart in her throat, she answered. Hello? Julia? This is Dr. Martinez. I have the results of your test. Silence. Julia couldn't breathe. Owen was so tense beside her, he seemed made of stone. And she could barely whisper. Congratulations. The doctor's voice was warm, genuinely happy. You're pregnant. And from the HCG levels, it looks like twins. The world stopped. Julia felt her legs weaken. Owen immediately held her, his arms firm around her, keeping her upright. Twins? She repeated, stunned. Are you sure? Pretty sure, but we'll confirm with ultrasound next week. But yes, the numbers indicate twin pregnancy. Congratulations to you both. Julia hung up in a daze. She slowly turned to Owen, who watched her with wide eyes, his face pale. I'm pregnant, she said, still not believing it. With twins. Owen said nothing. He just kept looking at her, as if she were a miracle he couldn't fully comprehend. And then suddenly he picked her up in his arms and spun her around, a huge smile, and the first real smile she'd ever seen on him, lighting up his face. Twins, he laughed, and the sound was pure, free, full of joy. You're going to have 2 babies. We're going to have 2 babies. He put her back on the ground but didn't let go. He held her face between his hands and kissed her, deep, passionate, completely stripped of any control or restraint. When they pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. 2, Julia repeated, amazed. How are we going to do this? 1 baby was already scary, but 2? Together, Owen said without hesitation. We'll do it together. Everything, every sleepless night, every dirty diaper, every first smile, every first word. Together. Together, Julia echoed, and the word sounded like a vow. That night, Owen didn't leave. He stayed at the apartment, made dinner, omelettes only slightly burned, and they ate sitting on the living room floor, laughing at how absurd and perfect everything was at the same time. Margaret had a rare moment of lucidity. She looked at Julia and said, You're glowing, dear. There's something different about you. I'm pregnant, Mom, Julia said softly, holding her hand. With twins. Margaret smiled. A genuine smile, full of love. You're going to be a wonderful mother, just like I tried to be for you. And then the moment passed and Margaret returned to the fog, but Julia treasured those words like gold. Later, lying in bed together, Owen rested his hand on Julia's still flat abdomen. "Hi," he whispered to her belly. "It's me, your dad. I still don't know much about being a father, but I'm going to try really hard. I promise. And you have the best mom in the world. She's strong and brave, and I'm the luckiest man in the world because she chose me." Julia felt the tears flow silently. Owen raised his eyes, saw her wet face. "What's wrong?" "I love you," she said, simply, honestly, without fear. Owen went still. For a long moment he said nothing, and Julia thought that maybe she'd gone too far, that maybe he wasn't ready to hear that yet. But then he moved, climbed up her body until their faces were level, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "I love you too," he whispered, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he himself was surprised by the discovery. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe from that first day in my office, maybe during the injections, maybe when you cried in my arms. But I love you, Julia, in a way that scares me and completes me at the same time." And he kissed her, a kiss that sealed something much deeper than any contract ever could, a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that whispered of love, family, home, a kiss that said, "You're mine and I'm yours, and together we are everything." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Medical appointments confirmed the twin pregnancy. Ultrasounds showed 2 small pulsing dots, 2 hearts beating in sync, 2 miracles growing inside Julia. Owen was present at every appointment, holding her hand, asking the doctors questions, looking at the blurred images on the screen as if they were the most precious works of art in the world. But there was still an unresolved tension between them. Confessions of love had been made, promises whispered in the dark, but physically they had restrained themselves. Kisses, caresses, hugs, but nothing more, as if both were waiting for the right moment, for the perfect alignment of courage and desire. That night the wait would come to an end. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the pregnancy confirmation. Owen arrived at the apartment earlier than usual, bringing flowers, pink peonies, Julia's favorites. Though she'd never told him that, he just knew. He paid attention to her details in a way that completely disarmed her. "They're beautiful," Julia said, inhaling the soft fragrance of the petals. Her eyes met his over the flowers. "Thank you." "You deserve flowers every day," Owen replied, his voice low, loaded with something deeper. They had dinner together, a simple meal that Owen prepared, pasta with fresh tomato sauce and basil. They talked about everything and nothing, about names for the babies, about what the nursery would be like, about fears and dreams. But beneath each word was an electric current, a growing tension that made the air between them vibrate. When they finished washing dishes side by side, Owen made no move to leave. He stood in the kitchen, hands in his pockets, looking at Julia with an intensity that made her heart race. "Stay," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a need. "I was planning to," he replied, taking a step toward her. Julia felt her breath catch. "Owen." He closed the distance between them, one hand rising to caress her cheek, his thumb tracing her jawline with a reverence that made her tremble. "Tell me what you want," he murmured, his eyes dark with desire. "You," Julia whispered without hesitation. "I want you." Something broke in his expression, the last barrier falling, the last defense crumbling. He kissed her, not gently, but with a hunger that had been suppressed for weeks. His tongue invaded her mouth, tasting, claiming. His hands slid down her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space between their bodies. Julia clung to his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. She felt his hardness pressed against her, the physical proof of desire he could no longer hide. "Bedroom," she managed to gasp between kisses. Owen needed no more convincing. In one fluid motion, he picked her up. Julia wrapped her legs around his waist, and he carried her down the hallway, his lips never leaving hers, stumbling slightly against the walls, laughing softly against her mouth. When they reached the bedroom, Owen gently laid her on the bed. Moonlight streamed through the window, bathing everything in soft, silvery light. He stood for a moment just looking at her, lying on the bed, hair spread across the pillow, lips swollen from kisses, eyes dark with desire. "You're so beautiful," he said, his voice hoarse. "So perfect." Julia reached out her hand. "Come here." Owen slowly removed his shirt, revealing his muscular chest, tanned skin, the defined lines of his abdomen. Julia felt her mouth go dry. He was beautiful in an almost painful way. He climbed onto the bed, hovering over her, one hand on each side of her head. He leaned down, kissed her again, this time more slowly, savoring every moment. "If you want to stop at any point," he murmured against her lips, "tell me. I promise I'll stop." "I won't want to stop," Julia promised, her hands exploring his back, feeling the muscles contract under her fingers. Owen smiled, that rare, devastating smile, and began unbuttoning her blouse. One button at a time, slowly, tortuously, each piece of skin revealed was kissed, worshipped, her neck, her collarbone, the valley between her breasts. Julia arched her back, her breathing ragged, as he removed the blouse completely, then her bra. When her breasts were exposed, Owen stopped, just looking with a reverence that made her blush. "Perfect," he whispered before lowering his head, his mouth capturing one nipple. Julia moaned, her hands burying in his hair, holding him there. His tongue circled, his teeth gently nibbling, and waves of pleasure coursed through her entire body. He devoted equal time to her other breast, while his hands worked to remove the rest of her clothes, pants, panties, until she was completely naked beneath him. Owen pulled back, sitting on his heels, and studied her body in the moonlight. His hands slid up her thighs, up her waist, traced the curve of her hips. "You're growing our babies here," he said reverently, his hand resting on her still flat abdomen. "You're incredible. You know that?" Julia felt tears sting. "Owen, it's true." He leaned down, kissed her belly tenderly. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me you." Then he continued his journey downward, kissing every inch of skin, her belly, her hips, the inside of her thighs. Julia trembled with anticipation, her fingers gripping the sheets. When his mouth finally found her in the most intimate place, Julia cried out. The pleasure was intense, overwhelming. His tongue explored, tasted, taking her higher and higher. His fingers joined in, sliding inside her, and Julia thought she might explode. "Owen, please," she begged, not knowing exactly what she was asking for, only knowing she needed more, needed him. He climbed up her body, kissing a path to her lips. Julia could taste herself on him, and it was strangely erotic. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time, his eyes searching hers. "Absolutely," Julia answered, her hands working to unbutton his pants. Owen helped, freeing himself from the rest of his clothes. When he was naked, Julia swallowed hard. He was magnificent, strong, masculine, perfect. He positioned himself between her legs, the tip of him brushing her entrance. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Julia saw everything. Love, desire, fear, hope, promises of the future. "I love you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I love you," she echoed, and then he entered her, slowly, carefully, giving her time to adjust. Julia gasped at the sensation of fullness, the feeling of being complete. Owen stopped when he was fully inside her, his forehead resting on hers, both breathing heavily. "You okay?" he asked, concerned. "Better than okay," Julia whispered. "Perfect." He began to move, slow at first, pulling out almost completely before sliding back inside. Each thrust deliberate, deep, hitting places inside her that made her see stars. Their breaths mingled, their sweaty skin slid against each other. The room filled with the sounds of love, low moans, whispered names, the sound of bodies meeting. Julia wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him deeper. Owen groaned her name like a prayer, the rhythm increasing, becoming more urgent. "Julia," he gasped, "you drive me crazy, completely crazy." "Then lose control with me," she whispered in his ear. "Let go." And he did. The rhythm became faster, more desperate. His hand found her clitoris, circling with precision, while he thrust into her harder. Julia felt the pleasure build, a wave rising, higher and higher. "Owen, I'm going to—" "I know, love, I know. Come with me." And she did. The orgasm hit her like lightning, coursing through every nerve ending, making her body arch and tremble. She screamed his name, her fingers digging into his back. Owen followed seconds later, his entire body contracting as he found his release inside her. He groaned low, deep, the most erotic sound Julia had ever heard. They stayed like that for long moments, intertwined, panting, slowly coming back to earth. Finally, Owen rolled to the side, but immediately pulled Julia into his arms, keeping her close. His hand lazily caressed her back, fingers tracing invisible patterns. "That was," he began, but words failed. "I know," Julia finished, smiling against his chest. He kissed the top of her head. "You're mine now, completely mine." "I always was," Julia replied, looking up to meet his eyes. And there, in the soft moonlight, with their bodies still intertwined and their hearts beating as one, they understood the fundamental truth. The agreement had been just the beginning. Love was what really mattered. And they had found something far more precious than any contract could guarantee. They had found each other. The following months were a complete transformation. Julia watched her body change daily, her belly growing, rounding with the two lives growing inside her. At 4 months, it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At 5, she needed completely new clothes. At 6, she felt the babies move, little kicks and punches that made her laugh and cry at the same time. And Owen was there for every moment. He'd moved completely into the apartment. Not officially, his things were still in his penthouse on the other side of town. But in practice, he slept beside Julia every night, woke with her every morning, placed his hand on her belly every time the babies kicked. He went to every medical appointment, memorized every piece of information the doctors gave, asked detailed questions about fetal development, nutrition, warning signs. He had a list on his phone with emergency numbers, the fastest routes to 3 different hospitals, and even a backup plan in case of traffic. "You're being a little obsessive," Julia said, laughing one morning, watching him review the list for the 10th time. "I want to be prepared," Owen replied, but there was a smile at the corner of his lips. "It's 2 babies, Julia. 2. That's a lot. You think I don't know?" She placed her hand over her enormous belly. "I'm the one carrying a watermelon on each side." Owen came closer, knelt in front of her, placed his hands on her belly. "How are my girls today?" he asked, talking to her belly as he did every morning. "Girls?" Julia raised an eyebrow. "We still don't know the gender. I have a feeling." He kissed her belly, then looked up with those grey eyes that still made Julia's heart race. "But whether they're boys or girls, I'll love them infinitely." Julia ran her fingers through his hair, tenderly. "You're going to be an incredible father. Only because I have the best partner in the world." Owen's company was growing exponentially. New contracts, international projects. But he'd made a radical change in his priorities. He delegated more, left the office at 5 in the afternoon, refused trips that would keep him away for more than a day. "The company can survive without me for a few hours," he'd say, when Julia felt guilty for taking up so much of his time. "But I can't survive away from you." And he kept his promise. He was there when Julia woke up nauseous in the middle of the night. He was there massaging her swollen feet. He was there reading books about fatherhood, setting up the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow because they didn't want to know the gender before birth. Margaret was declining. The moments of lucidity were increasingly rare. But Mrs. Chen took care of her with dedication, and on the rare occasions when Margaret emerged from the fog, she'd smile at Julia and say, "You look beautiful, dear, radiant." And Julia was, pregnant, in love, happy in a way she never imagined possible. At the beginning of the 7th month, on a sunny March afternoon, Owen took Julia for a drive. He refused to say where they were going, just asked her to trust him. They drove for about an hour, leaving the city, entering the more wooded areas of Westchester County. Finally, they stopped in front of a house, not a mansion, but a beautiful 2-story colonial-style home with a large yard, old trees, and a welcoming porch. "What's this?" Julia asked, confused. Owen got out of the car, walked around and helped her down. She was huge now, moving slowly, needing help with almost everything. "Our house," he said simply. "If you want it." Julia blinked, stunned. "What do you mean, our house?" "I bought it." "Well, technically I'm still buying it, but..." He ran his hand through his hair, nervous, a gesture she loved. "I wanted a place that was ours. Not my apartment where you moved in. Not a place that came with a contract, a place we chose together. A real home." Immediate tears. Pregnancy hormones made Julia cry over anything, but this was different. This was everything. "Want to see?" Owen asked, anxious. She nodded, unable to speak. He guided her through the house. 4 bedrooms, one for them, one for each baby, and one for Margaret when she needed more constant care. Spacious kitchen with a center island, living room with a fireplace, office overlooking the garden where Julia could work on her architectural projects, and upstairs, an attic transformed into an art studio lit by skylights. "For when you want to draw," Owen explained. "Your buildings that touch the sky." Julia couldn't hold it in anymore. She broke down in tears, that ugly cry with a runny nose, deep sobs. Owen immediately hugged her, worried. "You don't like it? We can look for another house. We can—" "No," Julia sobbed. "It's perfect. It's so perfect it hurts." He laughed softly, relieved, kissing her head. "So we're moving?" "Yes, 1,000 times yes." But Owen wasn't finished. He took her to the backyard, where there was a white gazebo covered with purple wisteria not yet in bloom, but promising beauty when spring fully arrived. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. "Julia," Owen began, and there was something different in his voice, nervousness, vulnerability. She turned to him, and her heart almost stopped. He was kneeling. "Owen," she whispered, her hands covering her mouth. He took a small velvet box from his pocket, opened it. Inside, a delicate ring, a blue sapphire stone surrounded by small diamonds. Simple, elegant, perfect. "I know we started all this backwards," he began, his voice choking. "We started with a contract. Then came the feelings, then the pregnancy, then the love, everything out of order, everything kind of chaotic." Julia laughed through her tears. "But," he continued, his eyes fixed on hers, "I can't imagine my life without you. I can't imagine a future where you're not by my side when I wake up, where I don't hear your laughter, where I don't hold your hand." He took a deep breath. "Julia Evans, you taught me what love is. You taught me that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's courage. You taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choice. About choosing to stay, even when it's hard. About choosing to love, even when it's scary." Tears were streaming down his face now too. "Marry me. Not because of the babies, not because of the agreement, but because you are my home, because wherever you are is where I belong. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to be half the incredible human being that you are." Julia was sobbing so hard she could barely see, but she managed to nod, managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Owen placed the ring on her finger with trembling hands. Then he stood and kissed her, a kiss wet with tears, a kiss that tasted of salt and promise, a kiss that sealed a future they'd both chosen. When they pulled apart, Owen placed his hand on her belly. "You hear that, babies? Your mum said yes. We're going to be a real family." And as if in response, both babies kicked at the same time. Julia and Owen laughed, cried, embraced in the garden that would be their garden, in the house that would be their house, building the family that would be their family. The move happened the following month. Owen hired the best professionals to make sure Julia didn't have to lift a box. Margaret was settled in her ground floor room, with Mrs. Chen taking care of her full-time. The babies' rooms were decorated, one in mint green tones, the other in soft peach, both full of stuffed animals, musical mobiles, and the love that already awaited them. Julia was in her 8th month when they had the ceremony. It wasn't a big wedding. There weren't hundreds of guests or extravagant decorations. It was intimate, simple, in their backyard, under the gazebo now covered with wisteria in full bloom. Just a few close friends, Mrs. Chen, the doctors who'd been following them, and Margaret, who had a rare moment of lucidity and was able to see her daughter get married. Julia wore a simple white cotton dress that accommodated her huge belly, wildflowers in her hair, barefoot on the grass. Owen wore grey pants and a white shirt, no tie. also barefoot. When it was time for the vows, Owen held her hands and said, "Julia, you came into my life when I was just an empty shell. I built an empire, but I didn't have a home. I had everything, but I had nothing. You gave me purpose, you gave me love, you gave me a reason to be better. I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life honoring you, protecting you, loving you with every part of my being. You are my love, my partner, my home." Julia could barely speak through her tears, but said, "Owen, you saved me when I was drowning. But more than that, you saw me, really saw me, and you made me believe I was worthy of being seen. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I'd never be loved. I promise to walk beside you always, in good days and bad, in joy and sorrow, because you are my heart, my safe harbor, my forever." When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Owen gently pulled her close, careful with her belly, and kissed her with a tenderness that made everyone present cry. And when they pulled apart, he whispered just for her, "My wife, my husband," she whispered back. And in that moment, under the blue spring sky, surrounded by fragrant wisteria and the love of people who cared, Julia and Owen officially became a family. But the truth is, they'd been a family for a long time. Since the first kiss, since the first confession, since the moment they chose each other despite all their fears. The contract had brought them together, but love had made them inseparable. The 9th month arrived like a storm of emotions. Julia was huge, uncomfortable, tired of carrying 2 babies who seemed to be competing to see who could kick harder. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached constantly, and sleeping had become practically impossible. Every position was uncomfortable, and the babies seemed most active exactly when she tried to rest. But Owen was there for every moment. He massaged her feet every night, arranged dozens of pillows around her in bed. Woke in the middle of the night to get her strange food cravings. Pickles with vanilla ice cream at 3 in the morning, instant noodles with peanut butter at 5. He never complained, just smiled, kissed her forehead and said, "Whatever my wife wants." Wife. The word still made her smile every time she heard it. Julia's water broke on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the scheduled C-section date. She was in the garden watering the flowers when she felt the warm liquid running down her legs. For a second she froze, processing what was happening. Then the first contraction hit her. "Owen!" she screamed, and there was panic in her voice. He appeared in seconds, running out of the house, eyes wide. "What is it? What?" Then he saw the liquid on the ground, the expression on her face, and understood immediately. Okay. It's happening. Everything's fine. We trained for this." He was clearly panicking, but trying to stay calm for her. "Hospital bag already in the car, documents, got them. Phone, charged, routes to the hospital, memorized. We can do this." Another contraction. Julia doubled over, grabbing his arm, the pain coursing through her abdomen like a giant wave. "Owen, it hurts." "I know, love, I know. We're getting you to the hospital right now." The next few minutes were a blur. Owen helped her to the car, drove with a mixture of speed and caution, holding her hand whenever he could, talking constantly to keep her calm, or perhaps to keep himself calm. "You're doing so well. Everything's fine. It's going to be perfect. The doctors are waiting. We're going to meet our babies. It's going to be beautiful." The hospital was a whirlwind of activity, medical staff, forms, transfer to the delivery room. Julia was already 4 centimeters dilated when they arrived. The contractions came in waves, closer and closer together, more and more intense. Owen didn't let go of her hand for a second. He stayed beside her, wiping the sweat from her forehead, whispering words of encouragement, breathing with her through each contraction. "You're doing so well," he repeated. "So well, you're the strongest woman I know." Hours passed. The pain intensified. Julia cried, screamed, squeezed Owen's hand so hard she left marks. He never pulled back, never left. Just stayed there, being her anchor in the storm. Finally, at 11:47 at night, Dr. Martinez said the magic words, "It's time. Let's meet your babies." The first baby was born at 11:52, a strong, indignant cry piercing the air of the delivery room. "It's a boy!" Dr. Martinez announced, raising the small baby, red, covered in vernix. Julia sobbed with relief and joy. Owen had tears streaming down his face, looking at that tiny creature who was half her, half him. 3 minutes later, at 11:55, the second baby was born. Another cry, a little softer but equally determined. "It's a girl!" Julia burst into tears. Owen was smiling so widely it seemed his face might split. He kissed her forehead repeatedly, whispering, "You did it, you're amazing, they're perfect, you're perfect." The babies were cleaned, weighed, measured. The boy, 3 kilos and 200 grams. The girl, 3 kilos exactly. Both healthy, both perfect. When they placed them in Julia's arms, still connected by tubes and wires to monitors, she looked at those tiny little faces and felt her heart explode with love. A love so immense, so overwhelming, it didn't fit inside her chest. "Hi, my babies," she whispered, tears falling onto the blankets wrapped around them. "I finally get to meet you. Finally get to see your little faces." Owen was kneeling beside the bed, one hand gently touching each baby's head, marveling. "They're perfect," he said, his voice choked. "So perfect. Thank you, Julia, thank you for giving me this, for giving us this." "Gabriel," Julia said softly, looking at the boy. "Gabriel Owen Blake." Owen swallowed hard, moved that she'd chosen his name. "And her," Julia continued, looking at the little girl. "Sophia Margaret Blake." "Margaret," Owen repeated, understanding. "After your mother." "Yes, so she can live on through my daughter." He kissed her then. A kiss salty with tears, a kiss that said everything words could never express. 2 days later, when they brought Julia home with the twins, Margaret was having a surprisingly lucid day. Mrs. Chen had helped her get ready, and she was sitting in the living room waiting. When Julia entered carrying Sophia, and Owen carrying Gabriel, Margaret looked up and her eyes lit with true recognition. "Julia," she said, her voice weak but clear. "My girl." "Hi, Mum." Julia approached, knelt with difficulty beside her chair. "Want to meet your grandchildren?" Margaret extended her trembling hands, and Julia carefully placed Sophia in her arms. Tears streamed down Margaret's wrinkled face as she looked at the little girl. "She's beautiful, so beautiful." Margaret stroked Sophia's pink cheek. "Like her mother, like I once was." "Her name is Sophia Margaret," Julia said softly. "In your honor." Margaret raised her eyes, and there was so much gratitude, so much love in that look that Julia felt her heart squeeze. "Thank you, dear. Thank you for letting me meet them before I go." "Mum, don't talk like that." But Margaret just smiled, a smile of acceptance, of peace. "It's okay. I lived, I loved. I saw my daughter become an incredible woman. I met my grandchildren. It's okay." Owen approached too, Gabriel still in his arms. "This is Gabriel," he said, lowering himself so Margaret could see. "2 beautiful babies," Margaret whispered. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Julia. Even better than I was." "You were the best mother," Julia sobbed. "The best." They stayed like that for long minutes, 3 generations together, connected by love, by blood, by bonds that not even illness could completely break. When Margaret finally fell asleep in her chair, Sophia still in her arms, Julia and Owen exchanged a look. They both knew. That moment was a gift, a farewell disguised as a welcome, and 2 weeks later Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. There was no pain, no suffering, just a smooth passage to the other side, as if she'd waited just long enough to meet her grandchildren and give her daughter one final blessing. The funeral was small, simple. Julia cried a lot, but there was also peace. Peace in knowing her mother was no longer trapped in a mind that didn't recognize her. Peace in knowing Margaret had seen the babies. Peace in knowing that she knew in the end that Julia would be okay. The following months were chaotic in a beautiful way. Sleepless nights, endless diapers, simultaneous crying, feedings every 3 hours, deep exhaustion. But also first smiles, first sounds, little fingers wrapping around theirs, the sweet smell of baby, giggles, curious little eyes discovering the world. Owen was a devoted father in a way Julia never could have predicted. He changed diapers without complaining, woke for the middle of the night feedings to bring the babies to Julia, and then put them back to sleep. sang terrible off-key lullabies that made the babies laugh, talked to Gabriel and Sophia as if they were adults, explaining concepts of architecture and business, making Julia laugh. "They don't understand anything you're saying," she said one morning, watching Owen explain principles of structural engineering to Gabriel, who was 3 months old and more interested in trying to eat his own foot. "It's never too early to learn," Owen replied with complete seriousness, then made a funny face that made Gabriel burst into laughter. Julia gradually returned to work. Owen kept his promise. She became Director of Sustainable Projects at Blake Construction. Her first project was a low-income residential complex with green technology, energy efficiency, and community spaces. It was everything she'd always dreamed of doing. Architecture that mattered, that changed lives, that made the world a little better. They had nannies to help during the day, but every evening and weekend was just theirs: Julia, Owen, Gabriel, and Sophia. A family. On the twins' first birthday, they threw a small party in the garden. Gabriel took his first wobbly steps toward Owen, who caught him in the air with a shout of joy. Sophia, more cautious, watched from afar before deciding to try too, immediately falling and crying until Julia picked her up. "They're so different," Julia commented, watching the twins. "Like us," Owen replied, kissing her temple, "perfect in their own way." One night, when the twins were finally asleep, Julia and Owen lay together in bed, exhausted but happy. "Do you remember the day we met?" Julia asked softly, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "How could I forget? You were so scared, but trying to seem brave. I was terrified. You were proposing the craziest thing I'd ever heard." Owen laughed softly. "It was crazy, but it worked. It worked." He kissed the top of her head. "In a way I never imagined. I wanted an heir, an arrangement without complications, something I could control." "And what did you get?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking, then answered, "I got a family, I got love, I got you. I got 2 amazing babies who completely stole my heart. I got a home. I got a reason to wake up every day smiling. I got everything I never knew I needed." Julia felt tears sting. "Me too, I was drowning, Owen, completely lost, and you threw me a rope." "No," he corrected gently, "we saved each other, one another." And it was true. They had saved each other. 2 broken people who found each other at the right time, who chose to heal together, who built something beautiful from the ashes of their previous lives. "I love you," Julia whispered. "I love you," Owen replied. "Today, tomorrow, always." Years later, when Gabriel and Sophia were 5 years old, Julia was in her home office working on a new project when she heard squeals coming from the garden. She looked out the window and saw Owen playing with the twins, chasing them between the trees, making funny monster voices, letting them catch him and fall to the ground where they both jumped on him laughing. She watched her husband, hair slightly grey at the temples now, laugh lines around his eyes from so many smiles, still as handsome as the day she met him. And she watched her children, Gabriel serious and thoughtful like his father, Sophia artistic and dreamy like her. And she thought about how strange life was, how a cold, calculated arrangement had transformed into the warmest family she could imagine, how the man who didn't know how to love had become the most devoted husband and father, how sometimes the most unlikely endings are the most perfect. Owen looked up at that moment, saw her in the window, and smiled. That smile that was only hers, that said, "You are my whole world." And Julia smiled back, touching the house pendant she still wore around her neck, and thought, "I'm home. Finally, completely home. Not in the apartment, not in the beautiful house with the garden, but in Owen, in the children, in the love they built together. That was her home, and there was no place in the world she'd rather be. In the end, Owen Blake didn't just find an heir. He found a home. He found someone who saw him beyond the walls he'd built, someone who loved him not despite his flaws but with them. Julia wasn't saved by a billionaire. She saved herself by choosing to believe she deserved to be loved. They proved that the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most perfect endings, that cold arrangements can transform into burning love, that families aren't born only from blood, but from daily choices to stay, to fight, to love. Sometimes all we need is someone willing to truly see us, And when we find that person, the impossible becomes inevitable. Because love doesn't follow contracts. It simply happens, and it changes everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the super thanks button as well. Comment and let us know where you're listening from. I'd love to know where you are right now, living your own stories of love and new beginnings. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you.